Hello everyone! Today's video is going to be a little different. It's something I haven't really wanted to do and have put off for, I don't know, a year, 2 years, as long as possible. The fact that I have done over 50 videos on Jane Eyre and its adaptations has naturally led some people to wonder what I think of other novels by the Brontë sisters. In particular, I've been asked several times, what do you think about Wuthering Heights? I've always given pretty much the same answer, which is that I have what I call a love-hate relationship with Wuthering Heights. In many ways, I enjoy the book, which I've read a few times, but it also drives me crazy, and there are parts of it that make my blood boil, and I don't enjoy that. As for the adaptations, I've seen a few, and have found each one dissatisfying in some way. In a nutshell, those are my thoughts on Wuthering Heights, so I suppose I could just end the video here, but I'm gonna guess that those of you who have asked that question or have wanted to ask that question are looking for a more meaty response. So this is for you. One comprehensive, all-in-one, and then I'm done video sharing my thoughts on Wuthering Heights. Disclaimer, this video is entirely subjective. These are all my own personal thoughts and opinions, and I am very aware, so aware, this is part of the reason why I didn't want to make this video, that not everyone will agree with me, and that's fine. But I guess I should warn you that I can get kind of worked up talking about this subject, which is why I waited a while after rereading the book to make this video, so that I would be a little less, but I still might come across a bit strong, a bit combative, so if I do, please don't take it personally. Also, this video contains spoilers for Wuthering Heights, the novel, and some of the adaptations. Summary of the book. Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte's only novel, was published in 1847 under the name Alice Bell. The action occurs between the 1770s and 1802 and revolves around the turbulent relationships between two landed families in Yorkshire and their interactions with Heathcliff, an adopted son. It's told mostly in a flashback. The frame story has housekeeper Ellen or Nellie Dean telling the dramatic family history of the Earnshaws of Wuthering Heights and the Lintons of Thrushcross Grange to Heathcliff's new tenant, Mr. Lockwood, while he's sick in bed. Ask people what this book is about, and the responses will vary. Some people will say it's one of the greatest love stories ever written. I say it's a story about revenge. Heathcliff is a little gypsy boy brought home to Wuthering Heights by Mr. Earnshaw to be raised with his two children, Hindley, who despises the boy and treats him like a servant, and Catherine, who becomes his closest companion. Years later, a series of events begins to separate them, and one night Heathcliff overhears Catherine telling Nellie that she feels it would degrade her to marry him. He disappears, and after making herself sick by searching for him, she goes ahead and marries neighbor Edgar Linton instead. Fast forward a few years, a now mysteriously wealthy and gentlemanly Heathcliff returns and starts to cause trouble. He stays at Wuthering Heights with Hindley, who's now master of the house, and gambles with him, winning away all his assets, including the house. Meanwhile, he drives a wedge of jealousy between Edgar and Catherine, and then elopes with Isabella, Edgar's sister, setting in motion a plan to take over not just the entire Earnshaw property, but the Linton property as well. Catherine dies after giving birth to a girl, Cathy. Hindley Earnshaw dies, leaving his son Hareton a penniless orphan at Wuthering Heights, unaware that Heathcliff's taken his inheritance. Isabella runs away from Heathcliff and gives birth to a son she names Linton. 12 years later, Isabella dies, and Linton is brought to Thrushcross Grange, only to be whisked away to Wuthering Heights by his father, who eventually forces young Cathy to marry Linton. Then Edgar dies, and Linton dies, leaving Cathy a penniless widow and an orphan, trapped at Wuthering Heights under the orders of her father-in-law Heathcliff, who for the 18 years that make up the bulk of the novel does not rest until he owns everything and has humiliated his enemies and their children. I first read Wuthering Heights when I was a preteen. I don't remember the exact age. I read it again to my sister in my early to mid-teens. I read it a third time as an assignment for an AP literature class, and I read it a fourth time just about a month or two ago for the purpose of making this video. And I took copious notes, which I have tried to organize and trim down a little bit for the purpose of filming this in as concise a way as possible. My copy is a 2001 edition that was part of a Scholastic Classics set I got in a book order when I was in 6th grade. I think it was the last book order of my life, which is so sad. Those were the best. It's got some lovely cover art, which is quite handsome and romantic, although maybe it's a little bit too pretty. Like I said at the beginning, I have what I describe as a love-hate relationship with this novel, and probably my commentary will reflect that. I've tried my best to organize my thoughts, but don't be surprised if you hear me swing from positive to negative to positive to negative. That is an accurate representation of how the book makes me feel. First of all, I love the title, Wuthering Heights. Wuthering is a Northern English dialect word to describe the roaring sound of strong wind blowing. The title itself is a reference to the Earnshaw house, the setting for a good portion of the action, and a property that key characters fight to possess. But something about that word wuthering also connotes the moodiness of the story, the stormy temperament of its characters, and the eerie atmosphere that Emily Brontë depicts, where gothic and supernatural elements disturb the minds of these individuals who are surrounded by the wild beauty of the moors. One thing people often comment on or complain about the first time they read the book is how confusing the names are. There are about a dozen characters in total, but there are a few names that get reused and passed down, which can make it difficult for a reader to keep track of who's who. If you haven't read the book, I'm sure that synopsis I gave a couple minutes ago was a nightmare to follow. That's one of the things I like, though, the almost palindromic nameplay. Catherine Earnshaw fantasizes about becoming Catherine Heathcliff, but she marries Edgar and becomes Catherine Linton. She gives birth to Catherine Linton, who marries and becomes Catherine Heathcliff, and when she marries again, she'll become Catherine Earnshaw. And the circle will be complete. There's something satisfying about that, even if it is a little absurd. I'm not sure why Emily Brontë decided to do that. I'm not sure if I think it's ingenious, or if it's just one of the many crazy things about the book. By the way, I've spent a lot of time debating how I should handle this name confusion, and decided that to keep the two characters straight in this review, I'm going to call the first or elder character Catherine, and her daughter Kathy, as the book does, sometimes. Even Emily wasn't consistent. One of the biggest challenges I have with the book is how intensely I dislike some of the characters. Wuthering Heights is a bit like a soap opera. There's drama between two families in this one cloistered area. It spans many years and 2 generations, and at times it seems like everyone's crazy. By crazy, I mean there's a lot of extreme behavior. It's so emotional. There are few conversations that don't result in some outburst. Tears, anger, accusations, hysteria, cursing, physical violence. Not a lot of calm personalities on display here. Some of the time I give the characters a pass because they're teenagers, and teenagers are prone to exaggeration and out-of-control emotions. But those unbridled tempers are hard to take. As much as I dislike many of the characters' personalities and their behavior, though, there does come a point when I feel sympathy for them. All of them. Catherine's mad illness, Edgar's disappointment and grief, Isabella's instant regret, Hindley's loss of the only thing he loves, Hareton's mistreatment at everyone's hands, Cathy's being manipulated and trapped, Linton's helplessness and terror, Heathcliff's desperate desire to have Catherine back, driving him to an alarming lunacy. I enjoy Wuthering Heights most as a character study. We get a surprisingly deep psychological analysis of all the players involved. Every character who appears in the book feels multifaceted. These people may not be quite like anyone I have ever known, and realistically speaking, I think that's a good thing because I don't like this much drama in my life. But when I finish the book, I am always satisfied and impressed by how well I got to know them and how alive they became. And I admire that there are so many parallels and mirror images and foils all over the place among the 5 members of one generation, Heathcliff, Catherine, Hindley, Edgar, Isabella, and their 3 offspring, Hareton, Cathy, and Linton. Notes on individual characters. I want to talk about each character a little bit, and I'll start with Nellie or Ellen Dean, who grows up with the Earnshaws and works for them, and has this unusual relationship where she's privy to their confidences and has special privileges, but she's still considered a servant. I think an argument could be made that Nellie is the true main character because she's a central figure and the bulk of the story is told through her eyes, but she's a static character with little growth, so I don't really go along with that argument. You could also claim, and I think there's truth to this, that she's an unreliable narrator. Her descriptions heavily influence how we view the characters. Hers is not an impartial report. Her language is often condemnatory, inclining us to share her negative feelings. An omniscient narrator wouldn't have so powerful an effect, allowing the dialogue to stand on its own with no interpretive side commentary. It is not lost on me that my opinions may be swayed by Nellie's subjectivity. Also, if you analyze her role, she's not a mere side character. She gets involved and bears partial responsibility, I think, for some of the major blow-ups. I like Nellie, but she has a tendency to meddle, and she lies occasionally, and she doesn't always make the wisest decisions. And there are consequences for that. Ellen Dean is often contrasted with Joseph, another minor servant character who's present for a good deal of the action. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that when I read the book to my sister, I ended up skipping over a lot of his dialect-heavy monologues. I haven't done that since. I understand what he's saying much better now. I think it's because I'm a little more familiar with what the Yorkshire accent is, and so I can figure out what he's saying. I've also learned that you gotta just plow through it, and it'll come together. That's not very helpful advice for how to read Yorkshire dialect. Sorry. Joseph's religious zealot is not super important, and yet he does serve a purpose. He's often condemning everybody and everything, and that contributes to the overall tone, and to the social and religious commentary, and also to the suggestion that every unlucky resident of Wuthering Heights ends up just a little bit wacky. Linton Heathcliff, son of Heathcliff and Isabella, is the most detestable character I find. Yes, he gets badly treated and abused, and that's terrible, and the fact that he's a sickly child probably isn't his fault and makes him more of a target. But he's so awful. He's a peevish brat, a spoiled, dishonest kid who may not have the strength to be a vicious tyrant like his father, but he would be if he had the physical stamina, as Cathy is dismayed to find out once she's stuck with him. I can't stand him at any point. Speaking of characters I don't like, Catherine Earnshaw I don't like in general because she is haughty, hot-tempered, selfish, and frustratingly changeable. She doesn't know her own mind, which causes Heathcliff and Edgar to suffer. Or maybe she does know her own mind, but she's being deceitful, which is just as bad. She wants to have her cake and eat it too. She wants to have the advantages of being married to Edgar, who she insists she does love, and I believe her, but I think she doesn't see that that kind of love is not the right kind of... it's not enough to marry someone for. But she doesn't want to let Heathcliff go either, and that's not fair. It's not fair to Heathcliff, it's not fair to Edgar, it's just bad. She's so self-centered that she deludes herself into thinking that she's some great peacemaker, when the reality is that everyone in the house is bending over backward to please her, getting along with each other because they don't want her to freak out at them. I will say that the films tend to depict her more kindly than the book does. The screen portrayals, possibly because it involves a real flesh and blood person, are more complimentary and easier to take, and therefore it's easier to feel sorry for her. I will also give her credit for how perceptive she is, and for acknowledging that even though she loves him, Heathcliff is a bad dude. She's aware of his wicked inclinations, just as she's aware of her own. They're like twins, after all, and she warns Isabella to stay away. Hindley, Edgar, and Isabella I lump together. I dislike the earlier versions of them, but feel sorry for them, and like how their characters change and develop in the second section. Hindley's a jerk, going all the way back to his childhood, but not entirely without provocation. And his wife had the potential to be his saving grace, but when she dies, he's pretty much destroyed. At least he does make an effort to stand up to Heathcliff, although that doesn't go very well. Edgar and Isabella are both kind of weak, which causes them to bend to Catherine's and Heathcliff's more dominant personalities. Both of them should have known they were playing with fire. There was abundant evidence, but they went ahead and did what they wanted anyway, and they both have to live with the consequences of their decisions, coming out sadder but wiser, and stronger. They both develop a backbone through their nightmarish dealings with Heathcliff and their endeavors to protect themselves and their children. Isabella is possibly the most sympathetic character. Her foolish infatuation with Heathcliff blinds her to any proof of his true nature, and that is sadly realistic. Because he decides it would be advantageous for a few reasons to lead her along, she deludes herself into thinking that he's as in love with her as she is with him. She has no clue how wrong for him she is, and that there will never be another woman for him but Catherine, which leads to a rude awakening not long after they elope. Her development from a fussy young lady who whines all the time to a woman with mettle who takes her fate into her own hands is admirable. The characters I feel sorriest for, though, are Cathy and Hareton, the unwitting victims who themselves have done nothing wrong, but because their parents are Heathcliff's sworn enemies, they must be punished. Cathy, daughter of Catherine and Edgar, in particular, makes an interesting study. I've gradually come to see her in a rather noble light, often sacrificing her own comfort and happiness to gratify others. This gets her into trouble, but it's a commendable quality, a goodness that Heathcliff seems to want to snuff out of her. Of course, her personality gets twisted by what she's forced to go through after her disastrous forced marriage to Linton, where she was locked up and given no help from the staff at Wuthering Heights. She becomes venomous. Lockwood can testify to that. For a period, she is a cold, spiteful person. But this isn't her real character, and fortunately, the damage isn't irreparable because she's not like the more vindictive members of her family. The worst thing Cathy does is to mock Hareton for his ignorance, and I'll point out she was prompted to do that by Linton. She also wildly misinterprets Hareton's thoughtful deeds and attempts to please her through self-improvement. But amazingly, those misunderstandings are cleared up and give way to a stunningly optimistic resolution, the only part of the book that makes me happy. Hareton is the most consistently likable character with no strings attached. He's rough, but that's through no fault of his own, and he does try. There's a latent sweetness about him and Cathy which Heathcliff can't kill no matter what he does, which is why they have the most potential to turn out to be decent, sane, and likable people in spite of everything. As for Heathcliff himself, like I said, I see Wuthering Heights as a story chiefly about revenge, and I see him as the antagonist, someone who is conniving and single-mindedly malevolent. But he is interesting, and there's something intriguing about his complexity. I am well aware that not everyone sees Heathcliff the way I do. I think the movies have something to do with that. The popular conception of him has been greatly influenced by the screen adaptations, which tend to show him in a more sympathetic light, dialing up the romance and toning down the revenge aspect, either by taking out some of his more offensive, violent actions, or cutting out the second generation completely, which is the part of the book where he is most vengeful. If you're hearing me talk about him like this, and you're thinking, what is she even going on about? Well, he doesn't actually kill anyone, to my knowledge, but his actions do precipitate the deaths of 4 people: Catherine, Hindley, Edgar, and Linton. He also ruins Catherine's marriage, seduces Isabella. He could have just left her alone after Catherine tells him about her crush, but instead he decided to use it to his advantage. Hangs Isabella's dog the night they elope. It would have been dead if Ellen hadn't found it. Severs Isabella from her family. Neglects and abuses Isabella. Takes all of Hindley's money and property by gambling with him all night, every night, even though he's drunk and probably not in full possession of his faculties. Cheats Hareton of his birthright and refuses to educate him, thereby relegating him to the station of an ignorant farmhand. Manipulates the servants and the local lawyer into doing his bidding. Abuses his son Linton and refuses to let the doctor come when he's dying. Beats Cathy. Forces Cathy to marry his son, who I think is underage. Keeps Nellie locked up in the house for several days so she can't intervene. Has Cathy locked up to keep her away from her father's deathbed until it's almost too late. Turns Linton against Cathy in her absence. Tries to override Edgar's arrangement to be buried next to his wife. And refuses to let Cathy leave the property even though her husband's dead and Heathcliff hates the sight of her. His abuse is verbal, emotional, and physical. He lies repeatedly, and he's the type guy who calls any woman he hates a slut. He does it twice, at least twice, to Isabella and to young Cathy. I have seen people attempt to excuse his actions by making it an issue of racial and social injustice. People treat him horribly as a child because he's poor and no one knows who his parents are, because he's a gypsy and dark-skinned, and because his quiet behavior is so different from that of other children, especially the lively Earnshaw kids. Heathcliff has awful things said to and about him, and he's kicked around simply because he's different. Heathcliff suffers, and it's wrong. But the way I see it, once he goes off on his own, he has a choice. He can move on, defying everyone's low expectations by making something of himself and being satisfied with that, or he can brood over the past and vow to get revenge on his enemies by getting the upper hand on them and destroying their lives. It was emotional pain that prompted him to leave, Catherine's apparent rejection of him in favor of Edgar, but Heathcliff is not driven by love or grief or ambition. He's driven by hatred and an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. It's his master plan to get revenge on Hindley, Edgar, and even Catherine. What's especially troubling and illuminating is that Heathcliff openly acknowledges that he enjoys hurting people. He's disgusted by fear and gets pleasure and amusement out of abusing the weak and perpetuating their misery. That's sick. I do find Heathcliff more palatable when he's older and has mellowed out some. He's still spitefully plotting, but he does so with a bitter humor that's interesting and makes him almost likable. And he does become more sympathetic toward the end. But no, I've never been in the Heathcliff is so hot and Heathcliff is so romantic camp. I find him too moody and too forceful to be attractive and not charismatic enough to be a sexy bad guy. That brings us to thoughts on Wuthering Heights as a romance. You know, in recent years, I've seen a lot of people, and you've probably seen it too, rant about the toxicity of relationships in contemporary and young adult romances, and rage against fans who obsess over characters like Edward Cullen and Christian Grey so much that they dismiss their manipulative, stalker-like behavior because they think they're hot, when in reality, a guy who does the things they do is creepy. Sometimes I agree with these rants, sometimes I think they go overboard, and let's face it, reviewers on the internet tend to be bombastic for entertainment's sake. I bet if Wuthering Heights were published today, Heathcliff would be received in the same divisive way that those characters have been. Some women would swoon over him, like they have for 200 years, and others would freak out at the swooners. Personally, Wuthering Heights as a love story doesn't do a whole lot for me. For some people, the Catherine and Heathcliff relationship has tremendous appeal. It's described as passionate and intense. To that I say, okay, can I have the boring kind of love then? Because I would never want to be in a relationship like this. I should say, I don't necessarily believe that the people who love this love story want to be in this kind of relationship, but they have an affection for it that I don't share. I see two headstrong individuals who use each other, who seldom come out and say what they actually mean, at least not when it's something pleasant or complimentary, and whose form of love causes destruction to the other person, and destruction to themselves. Heathcliff's devotion to Catherine is such that he begs her to haunt him after she's dead, and he digs up her fresh grave out of a desire to see her again. That's disturbing. I don't find that romantic at all. He doesn't follow through with getting the body out of the coffin, because he hears her sigh in the air around him, and that stops him before he can open it up, which is not the case in a couple of films, by the way. He does stand by while he has someone open her coffin 18 years later, and he's pleased when he sees her corpse, claiming she hasn't decomposed at all, which is gross. I don't like dead bodies, and I can't imagine loving anybody enough to want to go hold their dead body, and, 18 years later, there's a lengthy speech where he tells Nellie about longing for a glimpse of Catherine for 18 years and being driven mad by her teasing ghost. This is probably his most sympathetic speech, showing his fierce loyalty and devotion to her, which is his greatest strength. But I don't find that particularly romantic either. I don't know if I'm past the age of finding this kind of intense, destructive love appealing, or maybe I've just never been a fan of relationships where the two parties talk about hating each other so much. Even in their private moments together, there's this unnerving intensity and a thread of violent emotion and bitterness, and both of them have a morbid streak, though in their twisted way, I do believe they love each other. I don't know what Emily Bronte's intentions were, how she felt about Heathcliff, and how she wanted us to feel about the relationship. I find myself asking that question a lot as I go through the book. What was Emily thinking here, and how would she feel about the adaptations? Would she approve of the move to romanticize the story, or would she think, hey, that's not what I meant at all? Maybe I'd feel the romance more if we'd gotten to see more of them together as a couple. But because almost the entire story is told from Nellie's perspective, and the rest is told by Mr. Lockwood, who comes along after the fact, it doesn't go there. Heathcliff and Catherine go off alone together, but we don't know what they're talking about or what they're doing. The films tend to change that by inserting private conversations and a love scene or two, but those exchanges aren't in the book. There's no doubt that they're crazy about each other and that they yearn to be together again. Brontë was very keen on describing the desperate heartache of doomed lovers torn asunder, but she essentially left us to fill in the gaps and convince ourselves that at some point they were an ideal pair who were perfectly happy together. Contrast their relationship with Cathy and Hareton's, which has a rocky start and takes a long time to get anywhere, but has a much more healthy outcome. The second to last chapter of the book is such a turnaround. Lockwood comes back to settle his rent with Heathcliff a year later, only to find that Heathcliff is dead now, and Cathy and Hareton are in love, and that's following a charmingly bizarre and rocky courtship. It's the only part of the book that gives me genuine pleasure and a wholesome feeling, this return of honesty and innocence despite Heathcliff's best attempts to ruin Cathy's and Hareton's lives. Though I find the story so frustrating at times, especially in its second half, I'm okay with the ending. Heathcliff is undone by insubordination, by the invasive presence of pure joy and love in the house, and by Catherine's spirit's continuous teasing. Her daughter, who has her eyes, is always there, and he tells Nellie that the physical resemblance isn't a big deal to him because he sees Catherine everywhere, but he's startled at the sight of Hareton and Cathy together because of the memories they call to mind. Heathcliff embarks on this downward spiral, but he doesn't go in a final blaze of glory dragging everyone else down with him. It's a solitary decline. He confesses to Nellie that things have changed. His insatiable appetite for vengeance has weakened. He's realizing that all of his work was for nothing, that those years of hatred were pretty much a waste of energy. The ones left standing are resilient against him. They're turning to each other rather than against each other as he would wish. He has nothing to show for having wasted his life on revenge and cruelty. He's no happier, no healthier, he's gotten no satisfaction, he's restless and ready for the end. He has no interest in anything but being with Catherine again. The last chapter gives him more humanity, I think, than the whole book that preceded it, and that's even while Nellie is still wondering if there isn't something demonic about his origins. I don't know if it's accurate to say he goes insane. He stops eating and wanders around, staring into the middle distance at a vision of Catherine or Catherine's ghost, which is calling to him, teasing him, beckoning to him. His behavior is bizarre and strangely joyful. He's unrepentant to the last, though. He never acknowledges that he's been a monster and left a trail of broken lives and misery. His appearance in death is about as strange as his behavior in the days leading up to it, and he has his body shoved next to Catherine's, which is like a final insult to Edgar. Brontë closes with the implication that his ghost has been spotted walking alone and with Catherine's ghost. So neither of them gets to lie at rest, but they both kind of get what they wanted, being together in the afterlife, albeit in a spooky way that scares the locals. That makes me think Emily was rooting for their love and wanted them to end up together, although she tried to do it in a way that would be less offensive to Victorian sensibilities. It didn't exactly work out. The book was still controversial and considered morally offensive by many upon its release. Final thoughts on the novel. It's a book that's full of tragedy and unhappiness, high-strung and often unhinged emotions, and larger-than-life personalities. I like it as a character study, I like the psychology, I like the depth of the characters, I like the plot twists. I do get angry in certain spots when I'm reading it, and I don't know if that's the reaction Emily Brontë was going for, But it's to her credit, I think, that her writing inspires so much thought and such strong feeling. Better a powerful and memorable negative response than no response at all. The characters are not dull, and the story does not leave me apathetic. I also think it's a book that's better read twice, or at least twice. On a reread, it's easier to keep track of the characters and the timeline, which does jump around quite a bit. But you also know where things are headed, and therefore you can detect when Heathcliff is secretly plotting something, and you can pick up on parallels and things that add greater depth to the story and flesh out the characters even more. All that being said, I always have and always will prefer Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë over Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë for many, many reasons. And I don't think I have to go over all those because I've talked about that at length. Notes on some adaptations. For anyone who's still watching, I hope that this last part doesn't drive you away. Like I said at the beginning of the video, which seems like a long time ago now, I've seen a few adaptations, and I've found all of them lacking. They have their pros and cons, like most adaptations do, but all told, I just don't enjoy them very much. I think I'd rather read the book than watch these events play out on screen. You might enjoy the movies better if you're not familiar with the book, because then you're not distracted by how many drastic changes they've made, but that's not the case with my mom. She's not nearly as familiar with the book as I am, and she finds any adaptation of Wuthering Heights a bit of a drag. It's just so dark, and she can rewatch Jane Eyre's with me all day long, but Wuthering Heights is a different story. Obviously. I've seen each of these movies just once, and in the case of all but one, I saw them more than 10 years ago. I did jog my memory a bit by watching clips on YouTube, but still, a decade is a long time, so my comments will be relatively brief, and I'll try to go roughly in the order I saw them in. 1939. The 39 version features Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff and Merle Oberon as Catherine, with David Niven as Edgar, Geraldine Fitzgerald as Isabella, Flora Robson as Ellen, and the likes of Donald Crisp, Leo G. Carroll, Hugh Williams, and Cecil Kellaway in supporting roles. That's an impressive cast if you're an old movie fan. It was directed by William Wyler, one of old Hollywood's most consistently successful movie makers, who'd famously go on to direct The Best Years of Our Lives, Ben-Hur, Roman Holiday, Mrs. Miniver, Funny Girl, The Big Country, and The Heiress, among other things. 1939 is widely considered classic Hollywood's greatest year thanks to the successful release of this and a score of other timeless favorites. Personally, I view this version of Wuthering Heights as one of the most aesthetically appealing. There's something lyrical about the delivery of the dialogue, and the characters are more melancholy than explosive. It's beautifully filmed with a light sentimental touch that softens the book's harsher elements. Those that are even included, I mean. That's my main criticism of it. It only tells part of the story. It treats the novel's halfway point, Catherine's death, as a climax, and then speedily wraps things up. Sadly, it's not the only adaptation to do this. The cast is fine, though Laurence Olivier doesn't always match my idea of Heathcliff physically or temperamentally. Merle Oberon's Catherine is lively, changeable, jealous, and ultimately pathetic in a way that draws the pity of even the hardest-hearted viewer. The script makes numerous changes besides cutting out half the book, and some of these, for better or for worse, seem to have been adopted as canon. The ending, with the ghostly lovers walking hand in hand beginning their afterlife together, was added in post at Samuel Goldwyn's insistence using body doubles. It was a controversial conclusion, as it was felt to completely reinterpret the book's ending, but because of this film's enduring success, it's an image that's stuck in the public consciousness. If this version is all you know of Wuthering Heights, well, you've seen a good movie, but you haven't seen the full story. 1998. The '98 version is a TV movie directed by David Skinner. It features Robert Cavanaugh as Heathcliff and Orla Brady as Catherine, with Crispin Bonham Carter as Edgar, Flora Montgomery as Isabella, Polly Hemingway as Nellie, Ian Shaw as Hindley, Matthew Macfadyen as Hareton, Sarah Smart as young Cathy, William Mannering as Linton, and Peter Davison as Lockwood. I don't remember a lot of specifics about this one, so I can't comment on minor changes that may have been made, but I do remember feeling it was the most accurate adaptation of the book of those I'd seen. It's kind of a forgotten adaptation. It's not as well known as some others, perhaps because it doesn't have as much star power, or it's not as romanticized. The love story is there, and we have those moments of Heathcliff and Catherine together, but it doesn't shy away from showing Heathcliff's brutality, including one especially uncomfortable scene between him and Isabella. Rape is not mentioned or referred to in the book. However, I don't think it's entirely out of the realm of possibility, given how drastically changed Isabella is after they're married. Something has happened to kill her love and her spirit. The leads are considerably older than the characters they're playing, but I think they're both well cast. Cavanaugh's Heathcliff looks like a haunted man, and at appropriate times he can be murderous and terrifying, or deranged to the point of desperation. And I like that Orla Brady's Catherine comes across as less volatile. Rewatching her "I am Heathcliff" speech, I feel more the tragedy of that moment, Heathcliff rushing away in pain and shock without staying to hear the rest. If he had, what different outcome might there have been? The best thing about this version, I feel, is that it focuses so much on the second half of the book. It stays true to the Lockwood frame story and introduces Hareton and Cathy from the start. It does end with Heathcliff and Catherine appearing to happily reunite in death, or in Heathcliff's dying vision, but it brings the saga to a cheerful close with Hareton and Cathy's joy, and I like it that way. I've always felt this one was mostly faithful to the book, and therefore a pretty satisfying version of the story, and it manages to do it all in just under 2 hours. I've never wanted to see it again, though. It is still Wuthering Heights, and so it's still a rough story to watch. Those Cathy and Hareton scenes do a lot to lighten it up and make it more palatable, but if I want to see those, I can easily find them on YouTube because someone uploaded them for all the Matthew Macfadyen fans. 1992. The '92 version, also known as Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights for legal reasons, was directed by Peter Kosminski. It stars Ralph Fiennes as Heathcliff and Juliette Binoche as Catherine and Cathy. It also features Janet McTeer as Ellen Dean, Simon Shepherd as Edgar, and Sophie Ward as Isabella, with Jeremy Northam as Hindley, Jason Riddington as Hareton, Jonathan Firth as Linton, and Paul Jeffrey as Lockwood. I've got to be honest here. I have been convinced for years that I saw at least half of this version, but the more I look at pictures and video clips, the more I'm suspecting I saw a lot less than I believed I did. So this is awkward, but I'm gonna go ahead and say what I think of what I've seen. Considering it's a major motion picture, not a TV miniseries, it's surprising how closely it sticks to the book. The script retains a good deal of the dialogue, at least in some scenes, and it covers the second generation portion of the book in more than adequate detail. Ralph Fiennes is a magnetic and quietly ferocious Heathcliff. I can't say I ever pictured the character with blue eyes, but that's something that makes Fiennes' version of him striking. His gaze can be full of cold disdain or burning intensity, giving him a spooky look at times. It fits, as some characters wonder if Heathcliff is even human. Apparently, critics didn't like this film. They didn't take so well to Juliette Binoche's dual performance, particularly her accent, but I don't find it that obtrusive, and I think it's a cool idea to have mother and daughter played by the same actress. Many times in the book it's emphasized that Cathy has Earnshaw eyes, but Linton hair, and I think it's interesting to have Heathcliff constantly affronted by this startling likeness. The film does have some unusual takes, not the least of which is adding Emily Brontë to the story, played by Sinead O'Connor, but it has an aesthetic superiority, though not everything is pretty. There's an earthiness. Heathcliff often looks downright grungy, but also an unearthly quality, and a beautiful score by Ryuichi Sakamoto. I also like how Ellen and Hareton are portrayed, struggling with their conflicted loyalties. I bet if this movie was the only one I saw and I hadn't read the book, or I only read the book after seeing this movie, I'd have a very different opinion about the characters and the romance and the proper ratio of romance to revenge. 2009. The 2009 version was directed by Koki Giedroyc and was an ITV production. It stars Tom Hardy as Heathcliff and Charlotte Riley as Catherine, with Andrew Lincoln as Edgar, Rosalind Halstead as Isabella, Sarah Lancashire as Nellie, Bern Gorman as Hindley, Rebecca Knight as young Cathy, Andrew Hawley as Hareton, and Tom Paine as Linton. At almost 2.5 hours, this is the longest adaptation I've watched, and it too covers both halves of the book. It also has the unique distinction of featuring a couple actors on the brink of international stardom, Tom Hardy and Andrew Lincoln. This Heathcliff is the most intense I've seen. Hardy throws himself into it with a crazy charisma that's kinda scary. He's a calloused man, a master manipulator whose false charm is amusing, and ultimately an unpredictable madman. Catherine is no less intense, but I found myself with less sympathy to spare for her. The character is downright infuriating, so domineering and provoking. It's a more graphic adaptation in terms of violence and sexuality, with an outdoor love scene taking place after Hindley's whipped Heathcliff and before Edgar's proposed. By the way, Hardy and Riley fell in love while making this movie and became a couple. They've been married since 2014. In certain respects, it's a better adaptation than its predecessors because it spares zero punches in showing the destructive insanity of Heathcliff and Catherine's love. Theirs is a disturbing relationship. But the part with the younger generation is a little lackluster. There's not as much conflict between them because Cathy is kinder to and more receptive of Hareton from the start, and Linton gets a much more flattering portrayal. I'm not a fan of this adaptation. I saw it when it first premiered in the US on public television, and I really didn't like it. My dislike was so strong that it basically killed any interest I might have had in watching any more adaptations of Wuthering Heights. I'd had enough. However, I did watch another version recently because I've known it was out there for a long time, and I thought it might be good, and I wanted to be able to include it in this discussion. 1970. The 70 version features Timothy Dalton as Heathcliff and Anna Calder Marshall as Catherine, with Ian Ogilvy as Edgar, Hilary Heath as Isabella, Judy Cornwell as Nellie, Julian Glover as Hindley, and Harry Andrews as Mr. Earnshaw. I saw this only a week ago, so my memory of it is a lot fresher, but I'll try not to go on too much just to keep things even. This one does fairly well up to a certain point, but like the 1939 version, it fails as a complete adaptation of the novel. It starts with Catherine's funeral, flashes back to tell what led up to it for 90 minutes, and then has a 10-minute conclusion similar to what the 39 version did, but differing in the manner of Heathcliff's death. That 90-minute chunk is decent, it's watchable and goes into a satisfactory amount of detail, but the script also makes quite a few changes and surprising insinuations. For example, Mrs. Earnshaw is convinced Heathcliff is her husband's son, which gives his relationship with Catherine, which does get physical, more incestuous overtones. It's strangely implied that Nellie was in love with Hindley as a girl and always carried a torch for him, and there's doubt expressed about the paternity of Catherine's child, whose gender and fate are never actually revealed. As is the trend here, characters are portrayed in a more complimentary light, especially Joseph, wow, but it doesn't shy away from some of their more controversial behavior. The most abrasive example, Heathcliff actually strikes Catherine twice, and on both occasions, it's a precursor to an intimate moment, something I think modern audiences would view as problematic. Both leads also have an unusual look. Wide-eyed Catherine is impish at times and often has a dreamy expression on her face, and my mom and I agreed that Timothy Dalton has been far more attractive in other things. Somehow they made him look like a Vulcan here, and it's distracting. Characterizations and dialogue are fair enough, but I was shocked when I realized they were going to abandon the book's second half. I don't know why, but I'd had higher expectations for this one, so that was a letdown. The film does well at giving some depth to Isabella and Hindley, Nellie too, who's accurately portrayed as deeming herself the one cool, sensible person in the house who gets fed up with everyone else's nonsense. She's played excellently by Judy Cornwell, who, like Timothy Dalton, was in the 1983 adaptation of Jane Eyre, where she played my favorite Aunt Reed, if one can have a favorite Aunt Reed. The portrayal of Edgar was also quite good. Too bad he only got to play half the part. There were elements of this one I liked well enough, but I still found it wanting, and I still just didn't enjoy the story that much. I think to make the whole thing more palatable, it really needs that other half with the second generation to complete the picture and brighten things up at the end. Granted, it's in that second half where Heathcliff is especially beastly, but it all goes together. There are other adaptations out there, a 3-hour miniseries from 1967 with Ian McShane as Heathcliff and Angela Schuyler as Catherine, a 5-hour miniseries from 1978 with Ken Hutchison as Heathcliff and Kay Adshead as Catherine, a 2011 film with James Howson as the first Black Heathcliff and Kaya Scodelario as Catherine, and there are more besides. I'm just not interested in watching any of them. If anything, I would watch the 92 version in its entirety, because I've already seen so much of it, and overall I liked what I saw, and I'd like to be able to say, with certainty, yes, I have seen that version. But for the most part, I just don't have any craving for more Wuthering Heights films. I like the book for what it is. I appreciate how Emily Brontë tells this crazy story and develops conflict and character arcs. I don't seem to care for it half as much when it's abbreviated and changed into a visual format. So I'll stick with the book and be content with that, and if I ever want something different, there's that song by Kate Bush. It's me, I'm Kathy, I've come home, I'm so cold, let me in your window. Okay, this has gone on long enough. This video was far from easy to make, and I'm glad to have it behind me. I hope after all this you feel I have thoroughly answered that question, what do you think about Wuthering Heights? If you're still here, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video, and whether you share my thoughts on Wuthering Heights and its adaptations or not, you are quite welcome to leave your own thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to reading them, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.